Welcome to Disinfo Detox, where we cut through the noise to bring you the stories that matter. Today, we're examining the media's response to a significant development: President Donald Trump's executive order to declassify the remaining files on the assassination of former President John F. Kennedy. This directive, issued in January of 2025, also encompasses documents related to the assassinations of Robert F. Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr. Joining us is political scientist and host of the American Exception podcast, Dr. Aaron Good, who has extensively studied the complexities surrounding these historical events. Together, we'll explore how the news media has covered this declassification decision, the narratives that have emerged, and what this means for the public understanding of these pivotal moments in American history. Aaron Good, welcome to the Disinfo Detox.
Hey, thanks. It's great to be here.
John F. Kennedy was assassinated on November 22nd, 1963 in Dallas, Texas. Depending on who you ask, somewhere between 3, maybe even 5 shots rang out. And then supposedly Lee Harvey Oswald, who worked at the book depository, was a suspect. Someone fitting his description supposedly shot a police officer, and then Oswald was found in a movie theater. He was interrogated, and shortly thereafter shot on live television by Jack Ruby, a nightclub owner. The Warren Commission gave a report that said Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. There was a lot of folks who were skeptical of that conclusion in the 1970s. The House Congress did its own investigation, and it said it was Oswald was likely the part of a conspiracy to assassinate the president. And then Oliver Stone's movie JFK comes out in 1991. And it engenders a lot of skepticism about the official report. And this gets us to the JFK Act, which is supposed to release all the files in 25 years after 1992. In 2017, there's still thousands of files left. Trump authorized the release of some, but not all. Biden releases the authorization of some more. And then when Trump comes into his second term, he authorizes the declassification of all these files after they've gone through this committee. And that's when the FBI says, hey, we found 2,400 other files. What's going on here? So, Aaron Good, do I have that rundown of events pretty accurate? Is there anything else that you would add to that?
I mean, you could go into minute detail about all those different eras. I mean, you could talk about the Warren Commission era. You could talk about the Garrison case. You could talk about the House Select Committee investigation in the late 70s. You could talk about Oliver Stone's JFK and the JFK Records Act. But yeah, that's about it. It's been, I mean, you basically cover the arc of it, a long history of cover up and then partial disclosures, public outcry, more disclosures, and by now there's a lot of information about the assassination that we have. So we're still waiting for some official response and for the government to release the documents that it said it's going to, but we already really know a lot about the assassination and can say roughly what happened with confidence, I believe.
Okay, yeah, let's talk a little bit about that, because I heard a lot of people in news media trying to kind of temper down expectations, and they said there's not going to be a smoking gun. I think I've even heard Jefferson Morley say this, who's a longtime researcher on this topic. But can you talk a little bit about, since 1992, through the documents that have been released, what have we figured out? What has been pieced together that maybe was not known pre-1992?
Well, after the JFK Records Act was passed, they did slowly release over the years a number of documents that hadn't been released before. So we know things that we didn't know before with certainty. For example, we know that Clay Shaw was a paid contract agent of the Central Intelligence Agency, which was something that had been denied. So he had perjured himself, Clay Shaw had, in the Jim Garrison case. That's one small case. Another thing that we learned was that there was even more evidence of a massive blowout wound to the back of JFK's head. We already knew that all the doctors in Dallas said, yeah, he had a big hole and the nurses and witnesses said he had a big hole in the back of his head. It was an exit wound, right? And that indicates a shot from the front, which would make Oswald not the person who had fired the shot that killed JFK. And the understanding that we had until the JFK Records Act was that the people at the Naval Hospital did not see this wound in the back of the head. So there was some perhaps ambiguity about it. But we later found out that the House Select Committee had essentially classified and hidden the testimony of numerous people at the Naval Hospital in Bethesda, where the autopsy was carried out under military auspices. And many of those witnesses, I think virtually all of them reported almost all of them reported a big blowout wound to the back of the head. So that's one of the most, damning aspects of this whole case. We also know that the person that they had said took certain pictures of Kennedy's brain later denied having taken them and said that that couldn't have been me. I didn't even use that kind of film back then, and I was, that was my job. I was a photographer. So we just there are many things that come out. I think if you Jim Diogenio would be the person to really give you an itemized list of it all, but those are some of the revelations. We also know about Operation Northwoods because of the JFK Records Act. So this is a case where the Joint Chiefs, the Pentagon crazies, really, they wanted to stage false flag terror attacks that could be blamed on Cuba, some of which could have killed people, shootings, bombings, a hijacking of an airliner, things like this, and that this would have been used as a pretext to invade Cuba and overthrow the Castro's government. So this was something that people found very interesting, especially in the after 9/11. People looked at parallels between the two events, the proposed Operation Northwoods and then the real 9/11 attacks, which sparked a lot of wars. So there were a number of things that came out because of this that are sort of tangentially related, but they fill in more of our knowledge about the era and about how crazy, really, the national security state was. The Pentagon has destroyed a ton of its records, so there's not as much from them. And the real nature of the plot is up for debate. I don't believe that it was a strictly CIA affair. I think it likely had a thumbs up from the apex of the Pentagon, essentially. But this is, it's somewhat speculative and based on inferences that are informed by the way that the people operated during that era and the sort of mindset of the people that we can discern. So we know a lot, but we're still limited on the specifics of it. But I think the overall picture, we can say we understand who killed JFK in the broadest sense, which was the regime, the U.S. regime, not this or that, conspirator necessarily, but really a whole system that we only imperfectly understand as to how this country is actually ruled.
Yeah, let's get into that a little bit because you mentioned Garrison, and for folks who maybe haven't watched the film JFK by Oliver Stone, it profiles Jim Garrison's case that he brought to try and solve the JFK assassination. Right, he was a district attorney down in New Orleans, and because of his work, this is how the video of the JFK assassination came out. I think a lot of people don't know that the video wasn't available right away. And it was Henry. You want to talk a little about Henry Luce and how this video, what happened in the Zapruder film after the shooting, and kind of why Luce is such a controversial figure to be the one who was putting this video in a vault.
Right. Henry Luce at the time was an enemy of Ken. I mean, they were like both friends, but also political enemies because he was more conservative. Henry Luce was the publisher of Life magazine and Fortune magazine and Time magazine, and he was a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. And during World War II, when it was time to present the case to the American people for entering World War II and then taking a bigger role in the world, after World War II, after assuming the U.S. would win, Henry Luce was the person who wrote the American Century essay in Life magazine, really arguing for a U.S.-led empire, that would be based on free enterprise and such, which is basically saying we want America to enter this war and win and then be the leader of global capitalism is essentially the argument that he puts forward. It's an imperialistic argument, but not presented as empire. It's presented as freedom and an American century, not an American empire. But it really was an empire for Wall Street. I mean, and that's what he represented, Wall Street forces. The Council on Foreign Relations, which planned the U.S. entry into the war and the post-war peace, was funded by Wall Street titans. And this was their plan to, manage global capitalism on behalf of this oligarchy of corporate wealth in the United States. And so when Kennedy is killed in 1963, and he's an enemy of Luce, really, and of Luce's vision, I believe, they have an employee of Lifetime Life who's also a psychological operations intelligence officer, C.D. Jackson, a propagandist, basically. He goes and he purchases this video that was taken by I think a haberdasher or hairdresser or something. Abraham Zapruder. He had some strange, odd occupation considering his part in history. But anyway, he was filming this, and they went and they bought that film for like $150,000 or something like that, and then they secreted it away. I believe it's possible that the film has been altered according to people that worked on the Assassinations Archives Review Board, the ARRB, or Records and Review Board, right? Doug Horn did a lot of interviews with people, and there's reason to suspect that it was altered, and the chain of custody is strange with it. But regardless, what did end up happening was in Life magazine, they wouldn't allow this film to be shown, but in Life magazine, they printed stills from the shooting of the president, and they actually put them in the wrong order so as to make it look like the president's head went forward as though it got shot from behind. And this was pointed out by one of the people at the magazine, a guy named James Wagenvord, and he said, "Hey, why are you writing or why are you putting them this way in the alleys here? This is wrong." And that the person above him just gave him a cold, silent stare, and then he was like, "Okay, I'm not going to mess with this." But it's very significant, I think, that Henry Luce, the American Century propagandist, and then his subordinate, another propagandist who worked for the intelligence agencies, that they snatched this up, misrepresented what was on the film to the public, and then hid it away until it finally saw the light of day in the mid 70s, after a copy that had surfaced for the Garrison case. Eventually, like a bootleg had gone around to different places and then ended up being shown on national television, and it shocked the country, and it led to more pressure to create the second investigation in Congress, the House Select Committee on Assassinations, because the video seemed to show a pretty clear shot from the front. I mean, he's hit from the front and his head goes back. It's unmistakable. It's even more dramatically presented in Oliver Stone's JFK, but this is well known. When you add that and the lying about that in Life magazine, and then the evidence of a rear head wound that was covered up basically immediately, it's pretty clear that Kennedy was shot from the front, and that people knew this right away and sought to cover this up for years and years.
Okay, and what about you've mentioned there the intelligence community, and I think one of the things I found most fascinating out of the documents that have been released, particularly the ones since Trump's first term, I think they painted a little more clear picture of just how many folks in the establishment, government, intelligence community were in contact and or around Oswald before the assassination. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because to me, I thought that was, they say you'll never get a smoking gun, but I mean, I think that's about as close as you'll get to a smoking gun as far as what we've seen. But let me hear from you. What do you think about what we've seen so far there?
I mean, cumulatively, the damning evidence in this case is much more persuasive and conclusive than the so-called smoking gun tape in Watergate, which really Nixon, by the logic of the day of national security and protecting us against communism, Nixon could have justified the break-in by reference to trying to see if the Democrats were somehow working with Cubans in some way. I mean, this was like part of the argument that some people believed was the motivation for it, that they were looking for dirt to connect Castro to the Democrats. And it's not that different at all from what Hillary Clinton and the Obama intelligence agencies did to Trump with Russia. I mean, the parallels are overwhelming almost, right? But the evidence in the Oswald case of his connections to intelligence were enough for a Republican senator to say, I mean, to sum it up, saying the fingerprints of intelligence are all over Lee Oswald. That was Senator Schweiker from Pennsylvania, who was Ronald Reagan's running mate for a while, if you can believe that. And so this was pretty clear. In particular, you have Oswald in New Orleans, where he is handing out flyers and getting into altercations in support of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, which was this pro-Castro organization. But his activities there are very bizarre. He doesn't really do anything except for like these things that get turned into PR spectacles, and they involve all CIA assets. He at one point he wrote a letter about a confrontation with these people that ended up getting some publicity. And the problem was that he wrote this letter like a week before the actual confrontation happened. And that ended up being reported in the news. And he later had a debate on a radio show about it. And that radio show was between him and a CIA-backed group called the DRE, or a representative of that group. And the radio station itself was run by a guy named Ed Butler and his outfit called Inca, which is like maybe the Information Council on the Americas. And they were also a CIA front. Additionally, when he was passing out those flyers for the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, he supposedly just left his family to go and organize for the Fair Play for Cuba Committee in New Orleans. So he creates a chapter, which is the last place you'd ever create a Fair Play for Cuba chapter. You know, Carlos Marcello was tied in to the mafia. It was a very mobbed up city connected to Cuba intimately through Carlos Marcello and then Meyer Lansky and Santo Traficante and all that. It would be about up there with Miami in terms of places where you would never go to organize for Castro. But that's where Oswald went, and he was passing out flyers with the address of Guy Bannister on the flyers. And Guy Bannister was a right-wing anti-communist fanatic who had, loads and loads of files on communist agitators and other people. He was the head of the Caribbean Anti-Communist League, and he was a member of the right-wing Minutemen militia. He's a former FBI person. And around the 50s, as I understand it, a lot of FBI guys left the agency and set up sort of private investigation, businesses around the country. And they may have been able to act as kind of a shadow FBI national security entity that was sort of off the books. It seems like Bannister may have been doing something like that. But, he was working with Oswald, and that was at an office where you had people organizing things related to Operation Mongoose, in the aftermath of the Bay of Pigs invasion. I mean, it was totally connected to Cuban gun running and other anti-Castro operations with right-wing Cubans. And so his ties to that person are also really obvious. Additionally, the issues with his file are very strange. There are things that should have triggered a file on him being created much earlier, but they weren't. And the routing for his files is very bizarre, and people have concluded that people like Jeff Morley and John Newman and Peter Dale Scott, who've looked at this extensively, have concluded that Oswald was being manipulated and his file was manipulated by James Angleton, who's the head of counterintelligence, as part of a mole hunt. And so the ostensible excuse for filing everything on Oswald, having it all get routed to Angleton, was that it was to help to catch a mole somehow. And so there were little things that they did with Oswald's file, like sometimes he would be Lee Henry Oswald or Harvey Lee Oswald, and different little variations. And it's something of like I think it's called a barium meal or something like that. It's an analogy to like the X-ray when they have you swallow something so that they can trace where it goes in your body because it's radioactive. It'll show up on the X-ray. Well, they did similar things with Oswald so that you might be able to tell based on reports that they would get from different places who was leaking information, right? That's the ostensible excuse. But what it really did was it gave Angleton control of this figure and made sure that anything on him that would come up in government files or the investigations of any national security entity, it would come to Angleton. So he was able to run this guy, apparently as he saw fit. So that's another dubious aspect of Oswald and his connections to intelligence. There's also the fact that he went in and out of Russia as a defector, supposedly, with surprising ease after a release from a discharge from the Marines that was very easy for him to get, like a hardship discharge for his mother, which really makes no sense based on her actual condition. And his finances were not such that he should have been able to travel to Russia the way that he did. And there's also the question of the planes and boats and so on that he could have taken, because there don't seem to have been commercial travel options available. So it seems he quite likely was on some sort of military vessel to make it where he did, where he ultimately defected. He returns with with the daughter of a KGB officer, a high-ranking, I think a colonel, something like that, right? That's his wife, and yet there's really no problem from getting her into the country. His best friend in Dallas, is this white Russian CIA connected oil geologist who is an aristocrat, basically, whose father was like one of the top oil people in Azerbaijan, such that his father even knew Alan Dulles, the CIA director, back in the 20s. So this guy would have, Oswald's best friend was someone who had known Alan Dulles probably since he was a kid. And he passes, at one point, he passes Oswald off to these other people, the Paynes, and the Ruth Payne and Michael Payne. Michael Payne is the stepson of the inventor of the Bell helicopter, and he collected information on communist agitators and so on. And then Ruth Payne is the daughter of a woman who was best friends with Alan Dulles' mistress. So the connections between Dulles and these people are right there. Alan Dulles was the CIA director fired by JFK. And in
And
general, Oswald's so,
Warren Commission report too.
yes, the
Yeah.
most active member of the Warren Commission report was Alan Dulles. And in general, and by the way, George de Mohrenschildt, the white Russian, aristocratic fellow who became the best friend of this down and out, early 20s Marine defector, and then who returned to the United States. He later said that he only befriended Oswald because the CIA's man in Dallas, J. Walton Moore, told him to. He said, "Hey, there's this guy. We want you to befriend him and check him out." So he was apparently tasked with being Oswald's handler, and then he hands him off to the Paynes, and he goes to Haiti and gets like this $200,000 geology exploration for oil deal that seems like kind of a quid pro quo for it would seem. So really, when you look at Oswald on the whole and his strange associations and his strange ability to travel here and there and what he's doing with his time, it makes no sense at all unless you think that he's an intelligence operative, and then everything kind of makes perfect sense.
Let me ask you about one other person. I mentioned to you before we got on the show. I'll try not to nerd out too much on this topic. I appreciate the work you and others do, and I've always been interested in this topic. But one aspect of it I really haven't gone too in depth on is the history of Jack Ruby, and both pre and post the murder of Oswald. Can you talk to us a little bit about what is known about Jack Ruby and the different reasons he gave for assassinating Oswald in response to this assassination? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Right. So Ruby is the character who, as everyone knows, or most people would know, he shot Oswald as Oswald was being transferred. A couple days after the assassination, he is in a room full of policemen in Dallas, and he walks up to them and to Oswald and just shoots him. Now, Ruby was a local nightclub owner, but he was described by a lawyer as being a syndicate lieutenant. And that lawyer also said that he had back in 19 or was it, yeah, I think in 1950, right? That Ruby had testified to the Kefauver committee about the syndicate, and he gave some information about Chicago figures, reportedly, so that they would not investigate Dallas too much, where Ruby was. So Ruby was a syndicate figure, and it's difficult to explain exactly what his role was, except that he was connected to a number of events in the history of organized crime and the U.S. government that were really important. In 1939, he was in the room when this murder happened of the president of a junk handlers union, and this murder was written about later in RFK's book, The Enemy Within, as being pivotal for the the mob essentially taking control of Teamster pension funds, which is a huge scandal of the U.S. and a part of organized crime history. These Teamster loans from the pension fund were huge, and they could be given to people for all sorts of political favors for the mob, or they could just be bad loans that would go bad and it wouldn't matter because the Teamsters pension fund was so huge. So he's connected to that, and he was not, or he was originally arrested, but then nothing comes of it. He seems to have been an informant of some kind. And then in 1946, there's this murder of James Reagan, who was the wire service king. He owned the wire service that went out to all the cities and allowed people to get updates on the racing results and so on. And it was a means of corrupting local police departments, and essentially making them more mobbed up than they would have been, because you get people to take bribes for the wire service and gambling related things, then you kind of own them for everything. You can, once you have that corruption in place, it just is a kind of cancer, and it co-ops the law enforcement in different cities, and that was done all across the country. So, and Ruby was connected to the guys that killed James Reagan, and Reagan told people that he went to Hoover to try to explain to him how these Chicago guys were out to kill him, 'cause that's where Ruby came from originally. And he eventually, this reporter who was a friend of Reagan named Drew Pearson, really famous reporter back in the day, he wrote that after talking to Hoover, he learned that the Reagan thing tracked up to people in very high places, people like Henry Crown and Walter Annenberg, the guy who owned TV Guide and then the Racing Wire later. I mean, and he owned the Philadelphia Inquirer. I mean, basically oligarchs, are who we're talking about here. And so Jack Ruby is connected to this. He's also connected to this guy, Paul Roland Jones, who gets arrested for different drug, violations. But Ruby seems to be an informant in this way. That's one way to explain why Ruby is never charged for these things. They seem to find ways to get him out of these sort of damning circumstances. So Ruby seems to be a guy who is at the nexus of mafia and law enforcement corruption. And there was one file, I think it was an FBI file, where an informant, or a Federal Bureau of Narcotics file, an informant said that out in LA, when some people were talking about doing a drug deal and they wanted to get into Dallas or pass through Dallas, that the person they had to consult was Jack Ruby. He was going to give the go-ahead. So he was connected to the drug trade, and he was connected to police corruption, law enforcement corruption, and to the syndicate, the national crime syndicate that emerged, the Luciano Lansky Teamster syndicate that is still controversial today as to what it really represented. I'm of the mind that it was really a Lansky Teamster kind of a thing, and that the Italian mafia, and they ran the accounting, they set up the casinos in Havana and Vegas to launder all the money, and that they were really the more powerful force. And that the Italian mafia kind of took the more public-facing role, and they, in a sense, in that they ran the drugs in different places and handled the drug distribution at the retail level, and that something of a mythology has been created about this, that it's this Italian thing, when really, I think Lansky and the Teamsters were the more key actors, and Ruby was a big part of that. And so what happens with killing Ruby, or with using Ruby as the person to silence Oswald, it's not that, Ruby you just can't figure out who he belongs to. It's that Ruby, the people like the FBI and at the top of the FBI, the top of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, and James Angleton and the CIA, they've all been protecting Lansky and the national drug traffic. I mean, this is the relationship between the top drug traffickers and the intelligence agencies is extensive and really mind-blowing, and it ends up being, the money gets laundered, it gets folded into so-called legitimate businesses, and this has been a big part of American capitalism, and is probably a part of why we are so corrupt and lawless to the present day, and why you have all these crimes that are so terrible and they never get resolved, like Epstein, for example, recently. I mean, this was an era in which corruption and criminality and sort of mafia capitalism symbiosis gets established, along with imperialism and militarism, because a lot of these guys are invested in military, production as well, and Vietnam is a huge boon to them. Ruby is probably one of the easiest keys, if you can wade through the sort of complexity of it, to see that this was a huge cover up and that Ruby is one of the most radioactive, explosive figures if you were to really investigate him, and that's why they couldn't allow it to be investigated. It was a sort of ballsy move for the plotters to use Ruby in this way, but it's not that he's not suspicious. It's he's so suspicious that he points to corruption that the public could not possibly have been expecting, and that people in high places, they could have just said simply, this would be so damaging if this were actually investigated to the Cold War and the war for freedom and the war against the global communist conspiracy, that we have to cover it up for that reason. I mean, this is the corruption around this whole case exposes is so enormous that you when you start to grasp it, you understand why it's been covered up the way that it is, because this country is essentially, a mobbed up capitalist empire. I mean, you start to really think like, is there much difference between organized crime and capitalism in the first place, and imperialism? And I am of the mind that there really isn't, and that a lot of money and manipulation is put into making us not grasp this really fundamental fact.
Great point. I think The Sopranos illustrated that pretty well. The rollover between mafia and capitalism. Hey, before we
Yeah.
talk, I want to ask you a couple of questions about the present. Before we do, I guess we can do this kind of lightning round because I just want this out there, and you're one of the people I would trust to answer this. There's some aspects of the JFK assassination that get dismissed as false, and so I just want you to tell me, like, is there any there of these aspects of it? So the three tramps, these are the three figures who are on the grassy knoll, which some suspect would have been a part of where the bullet would have come from the front. The three tramps, right? Is there evidence to say these three individuals were there?
There were three tramps, and for a long time it was a huge mystery as to who they were. Eventually, they came up with a list of who they were, and they seem to have been hobos, some of them from West Virginia, or maybe all of them, as I recall. But it also was released so late that you couldn't be totally sure. I don't think that it's not been fruitful for anyone that has spent a bunch of time looking into them. Either they are tramps or they were figures who were maybe put there just to, if they weren't there because they were on the train and were actually vagrants, then they were probably people that were put in just to confuse the situation. I Other than that, because I don't think anything's ever been definitively shown that they were important in any way.
Okay, and what about this is in the beginning of the film too, but I've the woman who rolls out of the car, gets put into a hospital and says they're going to kill the president, and this happens prior to the president's death. Is there documentation to say that actually did happen? A woman was thrown in the car and did make that claim in the hospital.
Yes, the woman's name is Rose Cherami, and she worked with Jack Ruby, and she had been taken by a couple of presumably Cubans. She may have identified them as Cubans, and they were going to make a drug deal of some kind. But she was a junkie, and so she did this sort of thing, somewhat routinely, and that she somehow they start arguing, and she's maybe going through withdrawal, and they throw her out of the car. But they had been talking about how they were going to kill the president. And reportedly, from people that were in the hospital there, she was saying they're going to kill the president. And then she was also saying that Jack Ruby was going to be involved with this, and she predicted that he would kill Oswald or something to that effect. I mean, she made predictions that were, according to doctors and to this officer named, I think Dennis Frugier was his name, who tried to check out what she was saying. He found that she'd been reliable in the past. I think she'd been used as an informant before, and so he knew of her. It's a bit she and so she does make these statements according to several witnesses at the hospital. She had foreknowledge, and she worked with Jack Ruby and was also involved in the drug trade. So it seems that is a credible story. There's a lot of corroboration of it.
Okay, last one in this lightning round before we talk about the present. Mr. X is played by Donald Sutherland in the film JFK, and it's not really explained in the film where he's from in the government, but he says he's has some role in the government, and he kind of lays out, detailed step by step what the conspiracy would look like if it was coming from elements of the federal government. I'm not asking you to say did that conversation actually happen between Dallas Sutherland and Garrison, but is the character itself based on an individual who was in government and did make those claims?
Yeah, it's a composite of two characters that figure in the assassination in a sense, but one of them is the real character it's based on, and he was a consultant for the film. His name was L. Fletcher Prouty, and he wrote a book called The Secret Team in the 70s, which was one of the first exposés of the CIA and what it was doing around the world. And L. Fletcher Prouty was in the Pentagon. He made it to the rank of colonel, and his job during the Kennedy and Eisenhower years was to be the focal point officer, and he coordinated the covert operations between the Pentagon and the CIA. So if the CIA needed military equipment, hardware, assets from the Pentagon, he would help to facilitate that. And he never signed one of those CIA non-disclosure agreements or anything like that. So he felt that he could talk about some of these things, although he seemed to know about how far he could go and without getting into trouble. And he did try to communicate with Garrison about the assassination. He did quit after Dallas. He believed that Dallas was a plot and that the people that killed Kennedy were now running things, and he didn't want to be a part of that. So he quit after that. He also, I mean, in some ways, he's more interesting than what's in the movie because he was one of the people who drafted the Taylor McNamara report, which was written at the direction of RFK, presumably at the direction of JFK, even though the authors were listed as Taylor and McNamara, who were the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Maxwell Taylor, and then Robert McNamara, who was the Secretary of Defense. And so he, along with his Fletcher Prouty, who's Mr. X, along with his supervisor, who was a guy named General Krulak, they wrote this report together, and it was calling for a withdrawal from Vietnam. So he knew about Kennedy's plans to withdraw from Vietnam because he had been working on it. And not only that, but Kennedy's way of getting out of Vietnam was to send these guys, these top military guys, to write a do a fact-finding mission and so on, and write a report with recommendations. But the recommendations would be to call for a withdrawal. And this, I think, shows not only that Kennedy was pulling out of Vietnam, that was the policy, but that he felt that he had to handle this in a sort of surreptitious and kind of deceptive way so that he could say that it's the Pentagon that wants to do this, that he's not going against the military's knowledge of, how to fight communism and so on. And the other interesting thing about Prouty and Krulak, the two guys who worked on this report, was years later, Prouty sent a picture from Dealey Plaza to Krulak, and he said, "Hey, what's our old boss Edward Lansdale doing in this picture?" Or no, actually, he says, like, "Who is this in this picture?" And I'm wanting to get some confirmation here. And the guy says, "Oh yeah, that's got to be Ed Lansdale." Krulak does. What's he doing there? Because he's in Dealey Plaza, and so he's this guy. Ed Lansdale is like this covert operations specialist. He was instrumental in recovering and secreting away massive amounts of gold and platinum and so on that was the Japanese had looted, and he became, I think, probably ingratiated himself with Allen Dulles as a result of this, and became one of the most notorious, covert operators after that. And so, it's interesting that these two guys, based on a not very conclusive photograph, but apparently he's one of those guys, if you knew him, you'd recognize him even walking from behind, because he had a slouch and a big class ring and like a particular shaped head or whatever. So the character is really fascinating, and he's even more interesting than the one in the movie. He sometimes spoke more about things he didn't totally know about, so people have tried to discredit him in different ways, but he's a fascinating figure, and the scene is very compelling. So it's one of the interesting parts of the movie and of the real history.
Okay, we started out the show talking about how Donald Trump put this executive order he wants a plan from all these agencies for the release of the files, and he's created this committee that's being led by Representative Anna Paulina Luna. And Luna, said that it looks like there were two shooters, and this caught a lot of folks in the media off guard. So I wonder what you make by Representative Luna's comment and the media coverage of Luna's comment and just the release of the files in general.
I mean, on the one hand, it's funny that they're making anything at all of her assessment of this as a congressperson, like that she thinks there's two shooters. When, I mean, uh, RFK Jr. believe, or I'm sorry, RFK Jr. RFK Sr. The president's brother believed that JFK was killed as a result of some sort of Cuban CIA, plot basically, and also LBJ suspected the voiced suspicions that the CIA was involved. The people who were on the Warren Commission, like three of them, they said they didn't believe the magic bullet, the single bullet theory. They tried to even lodge a dissent. Really, they had a hearing and they expected it to go in the record, but it actually was not recorded by Alan Dulles. So they had a fake stenographer. This was Senator Russell, but then also Hale Boggs, who was a congressman, and I think Cooper, who was a congressman or a senator. Those were all Southern Democrat guys, but they didn't believe they didn't believe the single bullet thing, and it got sort of erased. And so they said it was a unanimous conclusion, but it really wasn't for the Warren Report. So the Warren Report people didn't believe it wasn't the Warren Report was the Warren Commission was not unanimous. JFK JFK's own brother RFK wanted to reinvestigate the assassination. Jackie and RFK sent a emissary to the Soviets immediately after, like on November 29th, a back channel to basically say, we know you didn't kill Jack. It was a domestic right-wing conspiracy. The quest for peace is going to have to wait until Bobby can get back into the White House because LBJ is too close to big business. They sent that a week after the assassination. When you have the House Select Committee in the late 70s, they conclude that there were other shots fired from somewhere else, even though they try to like fudge where they came from and everything else. And they said, oh, it was a probable conspiracy with maybe some mafia guys and some Cuban exiles, but we don't really know who. That's where they left it. But the person who was the chairman of the House Select Committee later came out to say, like, I now don't believe anything the CIA says. Everybody that tells you that they are a bunch of liars and not to be trusted is basically correct. And that I believe the national security state killed President Kennedy. And I believe he's even come down and said, like, that there was likely a shooter, a grassy knoll shooter, something to that effect. So a lot of people with a lot more position in high positions of more authority and expertise have come out and said that the Warren report, it couldn't be true. Luna's statements about this, it's silly that she would be taken to task for it, but I think that they've so memory hold so many of these details that they can get away with that. So it's funny that she's taken to task for this. I don't have much faith in her because she's super conservative and I think like of a religious bent that just I think that she was picked because she's a controlled entity basically. I can't imagine that this person is really that independent and doggedly in pursuit of the truth that we should necessarily have faith in her, but I'd love to be surprised. So I guess we'll see what they come up with.
Well, that's a nice segue. That's one of the things I wanted to ask, and I'm definitely going to have you back when these files are released, assuming they are released. But what are you expecting from this committee? What are you thinking? What should people expect? What should they look for?
Well, over at JFK Facts, which is on Substack, it's Jeff Morley's Substack, and he's a former Washington Post reporter, and he's written a number of books on subjects related to the JFK assassination, like a book on James Angleton and a book on Win Scott, who was the Mexico City CIA chief. He put together a list of 15 files that they hope they can get released. So, one of them involves George Joanides, who was someone who had worked with those Cubans who tangled with Oswald in New Orleans. And then later in the 1970s, he's used as the liaison between the House Select Committee investigation and the CIA. And he basically thwarts them. He's supposed to help them get documents. And instead, he, in his position, does everything to keep them from getting documents. This later, infuriated the staff when they learned that he wasn't someone who could have been helping them. He was someone who they should have interviewed as a suspect. Essentially. So this is what the CIA does. Arthur Schlesinger Jr., who was an advisor, sort of the court historian of JFK, he wrote a memo arguing that the CIA should be like radically organized, and that's still been redacted. So they're hoping that comes out. James Angleton's testimony might be that there are different documents of him testifying to the church committee and other entities about things related to Oswald that would be relevant. And yeah, a whole lot of different files like that. William Harvey's travel records. William Harvey is a guy who ran the ZR rifle assassination program. He was pretty much an anti-communist lunatic and an alcoholic, and not a guy who was very friendly with mob people. He helped to organize those CIA mafia plots to kill Castro. His travel records have not been released, and according to someone who worked with him, someone who worked with him implied very heavily that Harvey would have been involved in the assassination. He said something to the effect of like, they said, well, do you think Harvey could have killed been involved in the killing of President Kennedy? And this CIA officer's answer was, well, he was too young to have killed McKinley. So, take that as you will. There's a film, the Nix film, which is sort of like the Zapruder film, but we've never really seen the full version. The ones that we've seen have been missing frames that would have been very helpful to see. There's all sorts of documents like this. So I'd say for an exhaustive list, go look at the article at JFK Facts if people are interested in this subject. I'm writing an article now that deals with this, but it kind of focuses on Jack Ruby and the role of the National Crime Syndicate in the death of JFK. Because something that's interesting about this period is the way the mafia is handled. The FBN and the FBI want to say they want to deny that there's any kind of national crime syndicate, but then when there's too much evidence for it, they try to say that, oh, it's this mafia, La Cosa Nostra. We got to get to the bottom of it, right? But RFK Jr. was saying, look at the Teamsters and look at what they're doing around the country. And this was a more Teamster-centric version of the mob. It didn't get into Lansky so much, but it talked about the Teamsters. And there's all sorts of Teamster connections to Jack Ruby. But in the 70s, when Congress investigates, they cover up the Teamster thing, and they cover up some of Jack Ruby's associations as well, and they just go with this Italian mafia version of it. So this is, to me, is an important aspect. Peter Del Scott's done the best work on this, and I'm trying to build on this. But it's a key issue: is why have we not ever gotten to the bottom of this, and what RFK Jr. or what RFK Sr. was doing, trying to investigate the Teamsters and go after Jimmy Hoffa? Why did this cause so many shockwaves? And then Hoffa's supposedly so powerful, but then when they're reinvestigating the case around that time and these things are coming back to light, Hoffa just gets killed unceremoniously. So he apparently wasn't that powerful. Ditto for Sam Giancana, who was the ostensibly top mafia figure in the U.S. He gets killed around that time. So these people aren't that powerful. Meanwhile, Lansky is under investigation in the early 70s, and he just flees to Israel and stays there until 73 when Nixon's basically hamstrung by Watergate, and he comes back to the U.S. and he gets acquitted. Biggest gangster of the 20th century. So there's a lot there that's still mysterious to this day.
Hey, where can folks follow this great work and find you?
The American Exception podcast on Patreon. So it's Patreon/American Exception. And we have 200 episodes now, and we just did a 4-part series on Jack Ruby based on the work of Max Arvo, who really showed conclusively that Ruby was, right from the very early days, essentially given a team of lawyers that were connected to the mob and CIA's MK Ultra program, and they apparently dosed him with acid just so they could argue that he was insane. And then eventually he dies of a very, serendipitous cancer case that just kills him very quickly, and that solves that problem for them. But so we've been talking about that on the podcast and other things related to the gray alliance between the intelligence community and the organized crime syndicate that traffics lots and lots of drugs and has been partnering with the national security state all throughout the post-war era, really, since the end of World War II. It's really astounding, and it's been fascinating to cover this stuff, and that's where the podcast is where we do this.
All right. Well, Aaron, good. Thank you very much. Check out his work. Make sure you follow, like, subscribe, do all the things that the tech overlords demand to keep our show going. Have a good one.
Hey, Detoxers. Thanks again for tuning in. Make sure to like, subscribe, and follow Disinfo Detox wherever you get your podcasts. Detox complete.